Welcome, everyone here in London. I'm delighted to see you all here in person, and I believe we have something in excess of 1,000 people streaming this live all over the world. And I wish I hadn't said that because I've made myself quite nervous now. But anyway, it's too late. My name is Carolyn Paul. I am the head of health for Edelman across EMEA. The reason I'm here and the reason you're all in this space is I am thrilled to say that Edelman and Alzheimer's Disease International have partnered together for about 10 years now. During that time, lots of members of our teams have donated their time, their services, sometimes even the sweat of their brows to supporting ADI free of charge and as part of their voluntary contribution to society. And many of those are here today, and many of them have helped put this event together. So my thanks to them for all of their hard work over recent years, particularly to Sean standing at the back, without whom very little of this would have been feasible. I have to give a little bit of verbal small print, I'm afraid, before we kick off, which is Edelman is not responsible for the content of this session, and the views expressed, yes, you can all check your phones now, and the views expressed are the speaker's own. So if any of our clients' compliance teams are watching now, put your red pens down, because it's not to do with us guys, okay? I am delighted that we are hosting the first Alzheimer's Disease International end-of-year forecast. I hope it's going to become an annual event, and I think they do too. But we could not be happier to be putting this on for them. So without further ado, let me introduce two absolute luminaries of the Alzheimer's community. And I'm going to read my biographical notes so I do them both complete justice. Professor Jeff Cummings is a neurologist and professor of brain sciences at the Corcoran School of Medicine in the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Let's all have a nice thought for how warm it is in Las Vegas at the moment. Professor Cummings directs the Center of Transformative Neuroscience, which is dedicated to advancing medications that transform lives. He's built and led centers of excellence for Alzheimer's disease at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Cleveland Clinic in the US. He is a prolific author. I don't know how you found the time with all that, but he is a prolific author and has published more than 900 articles and 40 books on Alzheimer's disease and related topics. He has, of course, as you would expect, won many awards and is highly regarded for his work in Alzheimer's clinical trials and treatment development. And we are thrilled and honored he is here today. Alongside him is our good friend, Paola Barbarino, who is the CEO of Alzheimer's Disease International. Prior to taking this on, she was the CEO of Life and occupied senior positions with Cass Business School, Tate, the British Library, and many others. She is a council member of the World Dementia Council, a trustee of the Postal Museum, we must talk about stamps later, and a trustee of Lauderdale House. Previously, she was non-executive director of the Non-Communicable Disease Alliance, trustee of Shelter and of MLA London. She holds a degree summa cum laude in classics, I love a classicist, from Federico II Napoli University, an MA in Field Analytical Techniques in Archaeology, and an MA in Library and Information Science, both from the University College of London. And I have never felt more underqualified in my life than standing beside these two people. We are very eager to hear what you have both got to say. You can see the title here. We're talking about translating the Alzheimer treatment revolution, which I think is something we have all hugely welcomed, into real-world solutions. So I will hand over to you both now, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, everybody, for coming and listening to us today. This is the first, we hope, of a series of lectures that we will do at the end of the year. It is my pleasure to have Jeff with me. At the beginning of this journey, where we were building this, Chris Lynch came up with the idea of doing this lecture, and he asked me what I thought could be the thing that we could share with everybody and give some hope to people as well, given that we were going to do it in December. And immediately I thought of Jeff. First of all, Jeff and I have not had the chance to do this before. And secondly, the slide that Jeff will talk to you about was the one that most gave me hope last year. It's a wonderful slide, very synthetic, which tells you all the wonderful things that are happening around the world with clinical trials. However, this belies a number of difficulties as well. We know, and we know this at ADI more than anywhere else, that governments around the world are still woefully unprepared for any kind of treatment that is coming out of the Alzheimer revolution. And it is our job to stop this feeling of denial that there is nothing out there for people living with dementia, because things are happening, and we need the public to know that things are happening so that they will start demanding for change. Otherwise, that change doesn't happen. You know that a lot of our work focuses on getting governments ready, prepared, and delivering for people that live with dementia and their families. And I have the honor here to have with me one of the strongest advocates for dementia in the UK, Hilary Doxford, that has been with us for all of this period. I also want to thank briefly again Caroline, Paul, and Sean Beadle for being such fantastic partners with us in this journey in all these years. We really wouldn't have done what we've done without you. So without further ado, let's focus on the matter of things. So first of all, thank you for our sponsors for giving their sponsorship and help us do this event. And reminded, we are a charity. You're all welcome to donate. Whether you are at home or in here, you can always contribute to Alzheimer's Disease International. As an international charity, we don't get the kind of sponsors that national charities get. We've done the welcome and introductions. Now, a little note about ADI. For those of you who may not know, we were established in 1984. We are the international NGO behind the whole suite of diseases that lead to dementia, so from Alzheimer's disease, Lewy bodies, frontotemporal, cardiovascular, and so on, the many, many, sadly, diseases that have dementia as their end point. We represent our members, of which there is 105 all over the world. In England, our member is the Alzheimer's Society. And we represent them at the WHO, at the UN, at the OECD, and other global and international bodies, the G7, G20 most recently. And we promote World Alzheimer's Month, that many of you will have done, and we are the publisher of the World Alzheimer's Report. But our philosophy is that prevention, care, and inclusion are for today, whilst we all hope for a cure for tomorrow. And now, without further ado, I'm going to stop this. We're streaming these in over 60 languages with subtitles. On the screen, you should have a way to get into access our subtitle function. As ever with all ADI webinars, you can introduce yourself in the chat line, but please put your questions in the Q&A in Zoom so that the team can pick them up and send them to me. We've got all kinds of ways of doing this online today, and then we can try and answer your question at home. Jeffrey will talk to us now about this extraordinary slide that gave me such hope this year. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for flying all the way from Nevada to be with us for one day. You're a star. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. It's just a great pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to you and to ADI for inviting me to talk about something that I am really passionate about, which is developing new therapies for Alzheimer's disease. We've entered a new era, Paola. We have changed the nature of the question we can ask. We have gone from symptomatic therapies to therapies that are actually changing the disease itself. And that is a new era. We went 20 years from 2004 to 2017, almost 20 years, with no new approvals for medication, and we have never had medications that change the course of Alzheimer's disease. And now we are in this era. We are in a moment in history which is changing the science and changing the approach to disease. So it's just such a great time to be involved in Alzheimer's disease research. And what we've tried to do is to capture the progress in terms of therapeutics on this slide. And by the way, I love the topic of the year-end forecast, right? Because year-end is about looking backward. Forecast is about looking forward. So we're going to do both today. I'm delighted to do this. So this is looking back at the drugs that are in the pipeline at this moment. And you can see that each of those points with a name is a drug that is being developed in a clinical trial for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. So there are 127 drugs in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease right now. And you can see that they go from the outer circle, we call that phase 1. That's the earliest point of development where we determined, is that drug safe? And then most of the drugs are in phase 2. That's where they're actually tested in patients with Alzheimer's disease, and we determine, are we on the right track? Does this look like it's changing the biology of the disease? Does it look like it is helping this patient clinically? That's phase 2. If that works out, then they go into the inner circle, which is phase 3. That's the most advanced stage of testing. If they succeed in phase 3, then they would go on to approval or disapproval by regulatory authorities in each of the countries. Now, amazingly, it takes 10 years to get from phase 1 to phase 3. So you can see that we have to shorten that period. We have to discover how to compress the timelines. We have to marry the emerging science to the emerging therapies in a much tighter way than we do right now. There's so much to be done, but we're making such progress, Paola. We're thinking now, for example, that we have biomarkers that will help us determine whether the drug is working or not much more quickly than we can determine from looking at memory tests alone. So it's a great tool that we now have to understand the drug development process by using blood tests and brain scans to understand whether the drugs are affecting the disease in the way that we want. There are different types of drugs here. In the green area, those are drugs that are given intravenously or sometimes subcutaneously, but they're not taken by mouth. So they are molecules, they're drugs that are given in a different way. On the other hand, the purple drugs here, these are all drugs that are aimed at slowing the disease process, but they're all taken by mouth. And those are the drugs we really want to get to. We want to make it easy for people to take the new therapies for Alzheimer's disease. And the progress we're making right now is in the intravenous therapies. And that's kind of like what's happened in cancer and what's happened in arthritis. Those drugs are given intravenously. So we're in this process of having discovered how to change the brain, and now we want to do it with easier and simpler medications over time. The drugs in blue are drugs aimed at the neuropsychiatric symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. You know, it's common for patients with Alzheimer's to become agitated or to become depressed or to become psychotic, and those symptoms need treatment. And last year, in the US, we had the approval of the first drug for the treatment of any neuropsychiatric syndrome of Alzheimer's disease. It was an approval for the treatment of agitation in Alzheimer's disease. Very, very important that we're having progress in that symptom area as well as in slowing the disease process. Then in the orange part of the graph, we have drugs that are aimed at actually improving someone's medicine. The drugs that are in green and purple are aimed at slowing the disease. And that's really important because if we can start early enough, we would have very limited symptoms in those patients. On the other hand, some patients are going to develop symptoms and we need to improve those symptoms. And that's what the orange drugs are about. So you see that there's a lot of activity in the pipeline, Paola. And we're making a lot of progress. We have new approvals of these drugs that change the course, that improve the psychiatric symptoms, but we have such a long way to go. That's how these data are presented.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Now you will understand, all of you, why I thought this was incredible. And for the first time, it allowed me to understand the complexity. And bear in mind that behind every one of these compounds and stories, there are hours and hours of work. And also there are complexity and differentials of where these trials, for example, are located around the world. And I'm hoping that we will have a chance to speak about that later. But straight off the bat, Jeff, considering all the stories that many also here in the audience with us in the UK have been hearing over the summer on some of the anti-amyloid therapies, and some regulators approving them, some regulators not approving them. Can you tell us a little bit more what's happening? What do you think is going to happen in the next 6 months?
Yes, so thank you for this question, Paola. These new drugs are aimed specifically at a protein that accumulates in the brain in the course of Alzheimer's disease, and it kills the adjacent cells. So it is a very important part of the Alzheimer's disease process, and we finally have a way of labeling that protein and allowing the body's own cells then to get rid of that protein. It's a fantastic way of using the immune system of the individual to get rid of this protein that's accumulating. But these drugs are complicated. As I mentioned, they're given intravenously. They have important side effects when they are first introduced. So not only are they removing proteins from the brain, but they also remove proteins from the blood vessels. And that can allow leakage of fluid or blood into the brain. So we have to be very vigilant about that, because of course patient safety is number one in all of our treatments. But it is manageable, and we see that in the US we are able to transition from the very close monitoring in clinical trials to the use of these drugs in clinical practice in a safe way. And there have been very few complications so far in terms of its use in clinical practice. And I expect that these drugs will be more and more approved globally, so that as more confidence is gained in terms of our use of them and in our safe use of them, that more countries will agree to approve them, and importantly, will agree to pay for them. Because these, of course, are complex drugs and they're expensive drugs. But they're so important, Paola, as a first step. You know, we have to take the first step before we can go forward. And these drugs represent the first step, because we're changing the biology. We've turned the corner, we've opened the door. This is truly a breakthrough in terms of a new kind of therapy. Now we need to follow through on the kinds of therapies that we're developing.
Thank you, Jeff. And as many of you know, we continue also our advocacy to ensure that there is equity in the distribution of these drugs. So that even in the countries where they are approved, they can be accessed by everybody and not just those that can afford them, as is sadly happening in many, many countries. So the drug is approved, is deemed safe, but is actually not available for everyone. It's complicated, as Jeff says, a circle. Drugs are new, they're very expensive, and there is not yet enough people using them. It will have to be some time before the prices of these drugs come down, as it always does after they start getting take-up. But it's complex, and obviously it's not up to us to discuss how our society develops these drugs, but it's important for us to make sure that people can get access to them timely. And this is why we wanted to have this webinar. We wanted you to understand what's coming and be prepared, and hopefully help us advocate for the accessibility. But just continuing on your slide, there is a lot about tau. So people may have heard about anti-amyloid, but they don't understand tau. And there is quite a lot of that that is being developed. What can you tell us about tau? What's coming there?
Yes, so let's just step back a minute. There are the accumulation of several kinds of toxic chemicals in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. It's really a complicated process. So one of those proteins or chemicals we call amyloid, and the other major one we call tau. And we know that this tau chemical is very closely related to the actual clinical progression of the disease. So it looks like if we could limit tau, we would have an even greater impact on the disease than we have by limiting the amyloid. And there are numerous drugs in the pipeline that look at tau, and there is one of the biologics that is given, in this case, directly into the spinal fluid. And that drug looks like it is really changing the nature and the abundance of protein in the brain in a way that we need to have for a therapeutic response. But I'll just point out that you see that there are many colors in the dots that are on this. Each of those colors represents a different target in terms of the processes of Alzheimer's disease. And that's so fantastic that we're looking at many different kinds of processes because we don't know which one is going to offer the patient the greatest benefit. So tau is one of those, and I'll also say that combination therapy is coming. Just like combination therapy now dominates in cancer and it dominates in HIV, it is also going to be very important in terms of Alzheimer's disease therapeutics. So maybe we need amyloid treatment and tau treatment or some other combination in order to help our patients as much as we can. Our goal is to keep our patients functioning at the highest level for the longest period of time. That's our goal.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I hope this also answered the question of Marcia Cominetti that had come online on this very topic. Now, you mentioned the need for complex diagnostics, CSF. You talked about some scans, etc. So can you tell us a little bit, because many people are concerned about these procedures, or they are worried that there are no diagnostics available in their area. And also, perhaps you can touch briefly on the fact that there are blood biomarkers in the working. How do you feel about those? Are they really coming? Since I've been at ADI, everybody's always saying blood biomarkers are around the corner, but are they around the corner? Not yet. So from the point of view of the primary care physician who wants to be able to have those, what do we really have? And there will be many of those online.
Yes, so thank you for that great question. So we are this close to blood tests that will be able to allow us to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. And this is really important because even the best doctors sometimes mistake Alzheimer's disease for some other condition. And of course, we can only use these increasingly precise drugs, progression towards precision medicine, we can only use them if the patient actually has Alzheimer's disease. So the idea that we are so close to blood tests is really a great measure of progress in Alzheimer's disease. So we have measures that reflect the amyloid in the brain that we can measure in the blood. We have measures for the tau that we can measure in the blood, and we have measures of inflammation that we can now measure in the blood. Now we also have scans for these things, but scans are expensive, they're complicated, they demand a level of healthcare sophistication that is often lacking in many countries. So the idea that we're going to have blood tests means that we can democratize the care of Alzheimer's disease in the way that we want to for all Alzheimer's disease patients around the world, because it's feasible to get a blood test, and it's not feasible to get a brain scan on every patient who might have Alzheimer's disease. So we're really excited about this, and we can see that in the US, the FDA is starting to approve the blood test for eligibility in clinical trials. And that is really an important transition point for being able to apply these blood tests.
Well, I hope that has given a little bit of clarity home. There has been a lot of confusion around the issue of biomarkers in our field. It's still relatively a new concept, and it's sometimes used, I think, semantically and inappropriately, and people get they find the answers very convoluted. But I think what Jeff has told us is as clear as it can be. It really is coming. So this is also something for which primary healthcare systems need to get themselves ready. And as some of you will remember, when we launched the World Alzheimer's Report in September, 65% of healthcare practitioners globally still believe that dementia is part of normal aging and is not caused by disease. So we have got a mountain to climb. Although there are some really interesting other statistics that come from the same report, over 80% of healthcare practitioners would more likely diagnose Alzheimer's and dementia if they knew that there were treatments available. And similarly, more of the public, well over 90%, would ask for a diagnosis if they knew there was something to do. It's quite obvious, but it's something that we still need to understand. And there were 40,000 people in the survey globally, so it is a very representative sample. We know that these could really change the shape of how dementia and Alzheimer look for people at home for the years to come. So thank you, Jeff, for that. Now, there's something else on this slide that is fascinating. Some of you will have read the slide and recognize some names like memantine and donepezil. These are drugs that have been around for many, many years. And indeed, we at ADI tried to put one of them on the list of essential medicines of the WHO, and so far failed, despite them being around for many, many years, in part because in Africa, these drugs are still woefully expensive. They are not expensive in Europe, where they are generic drugs, but they still are in some parts of the world. So it did make sense. And also due to the current wars that sadly we are experiencing, we are seeing more and more people around the world having to go without these drugs in their countries. Maybe one day we'll succeed, maybe we'll find the money and energy again to try, but in the meantime, they are being repurposed. So tell us a bit about that.
Yes, so one thing to be aware of is that clinical trials are really great tools for understanding drugs, but they give us information on one drug at one dose in one population measured in one way. And so there's a lot to learn about drugs beyond the first clinical trial. And what's happening with these drugs that we know well and are now reappearing in the pipeline is that there might be new formulations. For example, donepezil is now being developed as an intramuscular injection so that people could get it less often, and we would make sure that people actually got the drug, which we don't know if we give them a pill. So new formulations is one reason that they reappear in the pipeline. And maybe there's extended release formulations, for example, that would appear in the pipeline. Another point I'd like to make, Paola, is there's a role for repurposing drugs. So we understand that drugs that are beneficial in Parkinson's disease, for example, have a lot of promise for being beneficial in Alzheimer's disease. Or maybe it's a cancer drug whose characteristics are such that it really looks like it would be helpful in Alzheimer's disease. So those are called repurposed drugs. They're approved for one thing, and we pull them into Alzheimer's disease therapeutics to see whether they would work in Alzheimer's disease. This is so important because then they don't have to go through animal testing. They've already gone through animal testing. They don't have to go through early phase testing because they already have for the original indication. So you can start far later, deeper into the pipeline, and theoretically, you could bring it to market faster. Now, what we really learn from those drugs is this a viable target? Is it a viable type of drug that affects that target? What about new biomarkers for that target? What about new clinical measures for that target? That's the real value of repurposed drugs, is that they teach us so much about the development of drugs in general, because we can put them into the pipeline very late and learn a lot from them. So repurposing is also a really important part of this. Almost 30% of the dots on this graph are repurposed agents.
That is great to know, no? Because this is going to be a lot faster because of what Jeff was saying. Things have already been tested on humans, and now it's an issue about looking at whether they work more broadly than the narrower scope they have been working on. And in that respect, digging deeper into the slide, there are another two drugs that have been a lot in the papers and that many people will know already, like metformin and like semaglutide, which of course there's been a lot talked about. So can you tell us how they are being developed or trialed for Alzheimer's and dementia?
Yes, so semaglutide, of course, has become so much a molecule in the news because of its success in diabetes and weight loss. But this drug also, in addition to having many metabolic effects, which makes it important in diabetes and weight loss, is also an anti-inflammatory drug. And that anti-inflammatory component combined with the metabolic component suggests that it may be useful in Alzheimer's disease. And it has succeeded in many circumstances. It has helped kidney disease. It's helped heart disease. Of course, it's helped diabetes, as we said. So this drug is succeeding in many ways, and I think there's reasons to be optimistic that it might succeed in Alzheimer's disease. And there are two very large clinical trials going on in the world, truly global clinical trials, to test semaglutide for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. We are going to know, Paola, by the end of 2025 whether semaglutide works or not. So when we talk about the forecast, this is really part of the forecast of Alzheimer's disease.
And I know that this will interest to a lot of people that already are on those drugs, and a lot of our member associations are really interested in what's happening with these molecules that are already around. But also in your slide, you talk about another thing that will intrigue people. There are things like caffeine, nicotine, cannabinoids, Chinese traditional medicine. What can you tell us about those?
Well, of course, we can't turn down any possible therapeutic avenue. There's no wrong door to get into the pipeline. So if the Chinese observation suggests that Chinese traditional medicines are helping patients with Alzheimer's disease, let's find that out. Let's put them into a rigorous clinical trial. Let's see what the outcomes are. What are the biomarker effects? What are the clinical effects? So that might also be true of caffeine, which we know is related to tau biology, for example. Chinese traditional medicines. We see cannabis coming into the pipeline for the treatment of agitation, because many observations suggest that cannabis may be a calming compound. We also see one example of a psychedelic coming into the pipeline, because that may well have effects on PTSD in patients without Alzheimer's disease, and agitation or being very distressed and upset in patients with Alzheimer's disease. So again, we have to have a broad approach to new therapeutics. We can't have foregone conclusions. The great thing about trials is they tell us whether the drug is working regardless of our biases against whether that drug might be successful or not.
Thank you, Jeff. So we're having a lot of questions coming in online. So I'm going to ask you one last question before we go. And this one is a complex one. So a lot of what is coming out now is for people at the early stages of the disease. But as we say in ADI, there is people at all kinds of stages. What can you tell us about what's coming up that may give hope to those that already are more advanced in Alzheimer's and dementia?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I think we should also go the other way. What about more advanced patients? And
yes,
what about prevention?
Absolutely,
let's
and
talk,
risk reduction, of course,
also.
we love that.
But let's start with the more advanced patients. I think we have to develop drugs for more advanced patients. Every patient who has early disease is eventually going on to have late disease. And so we have to find a way of trying to slow that progression into later stage disease, but once they're there, we have to be able to help them more than we are now. It's one of the reasons that the approval of drugs for like agitation is very important. But we think drugs like semaglutide, for example, a medication that you would take orally and that affects brain metabolism, or the way the brain works, could have application in later stage patients, even though for now it's being tested in early stage patients. In donepezil, it was first, this is a drug that's been around for a very long time. It was first developed in mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease and succeeded, and then it was tested in severe Alzheimer's disease and succeeded. So that's a common pathway, to start with one population, and if it works there, let's see whether we can get it to work in another part of the population. And I think that's what's coming, Paolo, that we'll see more and more of this building on success. That, by the way, is why you see so many phase 1 compounds in the green area, because the green area is where we're seeing most of the successes right now. So success drives success.
And that is also important for us to understand. One of the reasons why we do need to keep the interest in these new treatments is that we do desperately need more investment in research. In the Global Dementia Action Plan, this is the last area of the Global Dementia Action Plan, but not by any means unimportant. The fact is that if there is nobody studying what is happening in our field, we'll never find any kind of treatment for it. So we need to keep the pressure on, just as we need to keep the pressure on in diagnostics, in risk reduction, in care, and in the many areas that the plan focuses on. But talking about that just briefly, many of you may have read the risk reduction World Alzheimer's report last year, but if you haven't, please do pay attention to it. What's happening in the risk reduction area is equally, as Jeff says, super important. And in addition, it can be applied in any setting, in high-income country, low-income countries. Some studies suggest that 40% of all cases could be delayed or stopped altogether by adopting 14 lifestyle ideas and factors that can help you reduce it. There has been two new factors just discovered, and there is a new infographic that we have published. Having an awareness of that and what you can do is very important. The World Alzheimer report next year will focus on another area of great interest, which is cognitive rehabilitation. Can you slow down slower and better? Can the progression be halted temporarily, of course, but still give you more quality of life for longer? So we will be exploring that in September together, September 25. So, having asked all these questions, I think it's important that we open up to the audience. There is a lot of questions around. Don't know really where to start, but let's start with this. So this one is from Emily Ong, and it's online. Emily is one of the board members of ADI, incidentally, and she lives with dementia in Singapore. From the diagram, it shows that to treat or reduce psychiatric disorders is targeting inflammation. Could you elaborate more on inflammatory biomarkers? Thanks.
Yes, so one of the great areas of activity in the pipeline is anti-inflammatory drugs, because we know that inflammation accompanies the accumulation of these other toxins in the brain, and that if we could control the inflammation, we are likely to be able to improve that patient's course. Now, we have a lot of drugs, and we don't have very good biomarkers for that area. We have one biomarker which suggests that one kind of cell in the brain is activated, and if we could deactivate it, maybe that would be useful, but it's not enough. This is an area where biomarker discovery is so important, because the biomarkers are what guide our decisions about whether or not the drug is working. And we just need them. One of the reasons that there's more activity in cancer, for example, than there is in drug development for Alzheimer's is because they are ahead in terms of developing biomarkers for cancer, and they therefore had a higher success rate. And we've said that success breeds investment. So we need to get to that point where they are in cancer in terms of having biomarkers to guide drug development.
Thank you very much, and I hope that has answered the question, but it's also raised another issue, which is that in Alzheimer's and dementia, we are many years, many decades behind other disease groups like diabetes or cancer. When I was young, there was massive stigma around cancer, and that slowed down research. In Alzheimer's and dementia, sadly, we are still where cancer was 40 years ago. There is still massive stigma around Alzheimer's and dementia. This is why we are here. It's only by breaking that stigma that we'll attract more interest, more funding, more research, and hopefully a better outcome for people that live with it. So this is why this kind of gathering are important. I've got so many questions. I don't want to hog the limelight here. We have a really good question from someone online called Veshna. I don't know where she's writing from, saying that she's coming from the tropics, and she is asking, are there any of the drugs being tested out there on specific non-white or non-African American populations?
Yes.
This is a big question.
Yeah, this is a big question and a really important question, because drugs are developed largely in the United States and in the UK and Western Europe. And they're largely developed on white populations. And we need to know what is the impact of racial, ethnic, and other types of diversity on the drug response. And we simply cannot learn that if we test drugs only on white populations. So we have to diversify the testing of drugs. We have to diversify where in the world clinical trial sites are. We know right now that most sites are not in the tropical countries, for example. And so I really love this point that this person has made. It's so important because it's one of the things we must do in order to understand who benefits from the drugs that we are developing.
Part of our advocacy is around persuading governments also to become clinical trial sites. The fact is that many governments in the world are still in denial about having a population that has dementia. We have to say this because they focus on the disease of the young and not on the diseases of the old, for a number of issues we will not get into right now. But this is critical, because if a government doesn't do something to have a clinical trial site, in a way they are really making a disservice to their entire population. There will be an entire subset of people, of genetic information that will not be considered when trialing drugs. So this is something that we are increasingly aware of, increasingly include in our advocacy, but it's very difficult to understand somehow what is blocking, whether it's the lack of infrastructure, but sometimes also, for example, regulation that maybe has existed for completely different reasons and that have been left in the legislative equipment of the country that now are blocking them from hosting clinical trials. So this is something we have to work on more, and if anyone in the audience have any issues, please do get in touch, because we can always go to a government and discuss with them further about these things.
And I think, Paola, that the Alzheimer's Disease International Initiative on countries developing Alzheimer plans is so important, and it's part of the solution to having clinical trial sites more diversely in the world.
That's nice of you to say that, Jeff. We know how tough it is, so thank you to all of you. I know that there are few in this audience that are helping us with this task. Things are happening, you know, only this week we heard about Australia finally getting the dementia plan together. And so countries are starting to understand, but there is still, you know, the targets of the Global Dementia Action Plan are still far. 41 plans available over what should be over 100. So we still have a huge amount of work to do, but we will do it together, I'm sure, during 2025. That's my forecast. So there is also some interesting things happening online. For example, one gentleman called Cameron is asking, amyloid targeting drugs are related to significant reduction in brain volume. What are your thoughts on this, and why is it not being mentioned?
I'm sorry, I missed the second part of that.
So he wants to know that amyloid targeting are related to significant reduction in brain volume, and what are your thoughts on this,
yes.
and why is it not being mentioned?
Yes, thank you. So this has been seen in trials of the antibodies, the new therapies, but also in trials of some of the other drugs as well, which is that there's a reduction in brain volume when these drugs are given. So people have said, well, that's atrophy. Of course, an atrophy implies that the brain is somehow being injured by the therapy. As a matter of fact, we don't think that that is the case. Yes, the brain volume is decreased, but you have removed an enormous amount of amyloid, and you have also decreased the adjacent inflammation around those plaques. So you would expect a decrease in volume as you has changed the composition of the brain in response to the therapeutic intervention. So we think this is something very well known in multiple sclerosis, which has been called pseudoatrophy for at least 2 decades and has been recognized to be a product of many multiple sclerosis drugs. So yes, there is a change in volume. No, we do not think it is atrophy or brain injury.
I hope that clarifies the issues for those who are online. We have a lot of questions here, but I also want to give the audience in England. I can see there are some hands up. So can I ask you, the gentleman before you, and then you to pose your question? First, the gentleman behind. Yeah, sorry. I hope it is working.
Hello?
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Paola. My name is Ken Bluestone. I work with Age International, and we work with older people in low and middle-income countries. The medical advances we've heard about are just so exciting, but I wanted to shift the focus of our discussion a little bit to put this into the societal context in which these advances are delivered, in particular discrimination that people with dementia and such as ageism that older people with dementia are experiencing. And Paola, this question for you is, to what steps can we take to ensure that the human rights of people are protected so that they can benefit from these advances we've been hearing about?
It's a big question, and arguably the last 40 years ADI has been trying to resolve that very issue. It's been quite disheartening for us to see at multilateral level the lack of focus that has been given to the rights of all the people globally. All the people continue to be the Cinderella of the multilateral discourse. Nevertheless, things are progressively changing. The latest declaration by the G7 around their commitment to do more in the area of aging and in the area specifically of dementia has been heartening. We, of course, have a movement that was initiated by our wonderful member in Japan and then picked up by the Alzheimer Society in England, and then it became global, of dementia-friendly communities. The whole concept of dementia-friendly communities, of which Nori Graham, who is here in the room, has been one of the biggest teachers, is to make sure that people understand the inside of the person living with dementia, what they are going through, and therefore, by converse, to make sure that their rights are not trampled upon. But it's true to say, David, and everybody here that works in age, that even with the decade of healthy aging in place, We are still seeing in many countries abuses of human rights of older people. You just need to read our report on the situation in Africa to understand just how desperate that can be. And for example, in conflict situations where really older people are constantly forgotten. So we do need to raise the issue again and again and again. We cannot give up. Eventually, I hope it will be resolved. I doubt it will be in 25, but we will try our uttermost best to make more of it globally. So thank you for the question, David. The other gentleman in the room.
Thank you, Professor Cummings. That was great. Many of the outcomes that we use in clinical trials are not successful at indexing many of the cognitive and functional deficits that patients tell us about. Would you advocate that we be more enterprising and do a more thorough job? And as a corollary to that, is it possible the drugs we have approved are actually more efficacious than we suspect?
Yes, so Dr. Harrison, of course, is expert in this area, and I'm delighted with those questions, John. Thank you. It is amazing that the tools that we use, the main tool, for example, called the ADAS-Cog, was invented in 1984. And the mini mental state examination, which we use to come into trials, was invented in 1975. So these tools, although they are well ingrained and we understand them well, are not contemporary neuropsychological cognitive assessments. And we can do much better. We need to understand both the sensitivity of the measure so that we can detect subtle changes, and we need to understand the breadth of the measure so that we understand, well, is it memory? Is it language? Is it judgment that is being affected by these drugs? We need to understand that much more deeply than we do now. And we need innovation, John, and we are looking for you to lead that innovation because we know that that skill set exists here, of course, to develop the tools that can give us the information that we need in conjunction with the biomarkers. You see again the strength of the blood test to look at the relationship between the blood test and the clinical outcomes.
Thank you, Jeff, and I hope that covered. I can see nodding. I've got a really interesting two questions here, which are vaguely correlated. So I'm going to read them both to you, Jeff, and then we can discuss them. It will take some time. Thinking of precision medicine, this is from Kathy Service and is an online question. Thinking of precision medicine, can you elaborate more on safety concerns? I know the ApoE4 status has implications for risk. Close monitoring is also essential, and the accessibility for such monitors is also a concern. So this is the first one. The second, which is somehow related, it seems that from an anonymous attendee, it seems that with all the ongoing research, we need a significant number of participants. How will new blood tests increase participation amongst people living with dementia or those at risk of developing it? Do you anticipate any accessibility issues in low and middle income countries, especially considering that the ApoE test costs around $500 US? What can be done to reduce these costs?
Yes, really great question and a really informed question. There is a gene that places people at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, and it's called the ApoE4 gene. And it's readily tested for in the blood, but as you hear, it is also expensive to do that. We have not encouraged the use of ApoE4 because you can have this gene and not get Alzheimer's disease. And you can get Alzheimer's disease without having the gene. But it is a very powerful risk factor. So a person without the gene has a 15% lifetime risk of Alzheimer's disease. So no gene, they still get the disease. If you have one copy of the gene, your lifetime risk is about 30 or 40%. If you have two copies of the gene, you got one from your mother and one from your father, your lifetime risk is probably in excess of 90%. You're almost certainly going to get the disease. So this is a very powerful predictor of who's going to get Alzheimer's disease. That it has but there are people who have it and don't get the disease. So what about making it more globally available? It's become increasingly important because that gene also determines the risk of getting the side effects of the new medication. So that the people who have this leakage of fluid into the brain, they are the ones who are also carrying this gene, the ApoE4 gene. So it's become even more critical that as these drugs become more widely available, we also have to have this blood test in order to be able to forecast who might get side effects, to monitor those patients more fully, and of course to give the patient the opportunity to say, no, we think the risk is too high because I know that mom is carrying the E4 gene. So there are now many reasons that the E4 gene has come into focus as very important. And of course, as more people get it, the cost will come down. But we have to insist on that. We have to find ways to get these tests to more and more people.
So thank you for that, Jeff. And there was another question of somebody that was asking about whether these medications the price would come down. It will come down as there is an economy of scale, as more people get into that. And in that respect, it's disheartening for us at ADI to see that despite us calling for government to get prepared since many years, I think we published the first index on preparedness of governments in 2017, and yet so many governments around the world are not getting ready and not preparing, and indeed using their lack of preparedness almost as an excuse not to get the treatments available to the public. But that is inexcusable. In other disease areas, that would not be acceptable. And it's extremely important that as a public of people that is affected, continue to demand for change. There are 55 million people living with dementia as we speak, probably more, and the projections are for 135 plus in only a few years' time. So this is not going to go away. Indeed, some of the projected figures are even higher. They're certainly higher than when we first estimated them in 2009. So governments have to get ready. We cannot allow them not to get ready. This is absolutely critical, I think, to our mission.
And that's, that brings to mind one thing, Paola, which is we have this projection of 150 million people involved by 2050. I think we have to say to ourselves, that's an unacceptable future. That's why we have to have therapeutic development. That's why we have to have prevention. That's why we have to get people involved in lifestyle changes that decrease their risk. These are the things which can change the future and give us the ability to have a brain span that matches our lifespan, and that's what we're trying to achieve for us and for our patients.
And I think, Jeff, reflecting upon what you were just saying, we know about ApoE4, no? But do you feel there is more that we are going to discover in the area of genetics? Because, of course, in cancer is now becoming so important. You're screened for your genes very early on. Do you think we'll ever get to that point?
There are so many genetic influences that are now being discovered. So this E4 gene that we've discussed is the most powerful that we know about. But there are now genetic risk scores that take a whole variety of genes into account, because there are people who have the E4 gene and are unlikely to get Alzheimer's disease because they have protective genes, or they have the E4 gene and are very likely to get Alzheimer's disease because they have other genes that also increase the risk for the disease. So we can see that this complex biology is driven by a complex genetics. And as we understand the biology more, we are also understanding the genetics more.
And this tells us just how important this is and why it's important that we continue to study. There is still so much we don't know. And in many areas, we are still working on hypotheses, aren't we? And we don't know how all the bits of the jigsaw puzzle will get together eventually. But we are the beginning, I feel, of a real change in what you're doing. But Jeff, you have been in there from the beginning. Do you feel we are at a really important moment in our history?
You know, I'm just so excited about this. I hope I've communicated some of my enthusiasm, because we are truly in a new era. We have truly opened the door to understanding and manipulating the biology of Alzheimer's disease for the benefit of our patients. And I just can't tell you what a new lease on life that represents in terms of the scientific interrogation of Alzheimer's disease.
Well, I thank Jeff. I think we're in perfect timing now. It's just 2 o'clock. And I thank all of you that have come. Those of us that are in London, this is one of the first in-person events we've done for a long time. Those of you who are in London will be able to take part in some more networking and hopefully some festive nibbles. I know that many of you in the world will not know what the festive element is, but it's almost Christmas in England. So we will also take it as an opportunity to wish each other good work for the year to come. And I thank the hundreds, thousands of you online, I don't know, and from wherever you are in the world. I know that we're more than 100 countries online at some point. So thank you for coming and attending to these. Thank you for our audience in London. Thank you, Jeff, for coming. Thank you, Edelman, for hosting us. Thank you, Jane and Megan, for organizing yet another spectacular event. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.